Thank you so much for having me here to deliver this year's League of Oregon Cities Conference keynote. These are unprecedented times, and Oregon and the nation is going through a reckoning. This goes beyond the frameworks of diversity and inclusion, which often are about tokenizing folks of color, about getting them in the room, but not changing the structures and the systems that maintain hierarchy and oppression. This is a time of justice. Diversity might be about getting a couple brown faces to the table or in the room, but justice looks at the room itself. How power functions, who controls it, who owns the room, and how can we all transform every piece of that structurally. The goal right now has to be institutional change, deep transformational change. It cannot be just surface reform because white supremacy is institutional. So the response must also be institutional. It's not enough to just tinker with things as they are. It's not enough to designate task forces. It's not enough to make statements. Institutions that shape all of our lives have to be reimagined, reinvented, and many of them are going to need to be dismantled and replaced if we are to institute real and true justice. I say this as a historian, as someone who studies history. Because when you study the history of Oregon, you will see that the foundation of this place that we are is the notion of a racist white utopia. That is what has created everything around us. It is rooted in the notion of this place as a utopia specifically for white people. And all of the institutions that shape all of our lives were rooted in that and have been grown in that. It is incredibly important to bring this framing and this lens, which is rooted in history, because it allows us to see that the system is not broken. It is functioning as it was intended because the intended outcome was white supremacy. And therefore, if we want to institute racial justice, we are going to have to fundamentally transform these institutions and fundamentally reimagine what we consider to be the shape of our society and this place that we live. I'm going to take you through an abbreviated timeline that looks at the history of Oregon through the lens of race, identity, and power. There are a few takeaways that I'm hoping folks will have from this, and I like to say them up front so we're all clear about where I'm going, and then you can decide whether or not you want to go there with me. The first takeaway, as I've said, is that white supremacy is institutional. And so anti-racism must be institutionalized if we are to combat white supremacy. Everyone is culpable, and all of the institutions and all of the spaces that have been created are culpable. But government is especially culpable. And I'll be showing the ways that that has and continues to function in our society. And lastly, and I believe most importantly, one of the biggest takeaways is to root in the vision and the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. Communities of color have never been passive victims. They have always been active change makers, and they have made this space better for everyone. And so their leadership needs to be centered, not just included on the edges, but pushed to the center to allow us to truly reimagine this place and to imagine and then build into existence what real justice can look like. So I'm going to share some slides again that allow us to explore this notion of this history and race and identity and power. The first is I will be sharing slides from my Oregon Black History timeline. And so I wanted to share a YouTube video that I created. If you just look up Oregon Black History timeline on YouTube or on Google, you will find this video. It has a much longer version of the timeline that I'm sharing with you. So if you're wanting to get more information, or if you're wanting to get the information that I share today, you can just Google or go to YouTube and type in Oregon Black History Timeline. So the foundation, as I said, of this place that we live is the idea of a racist white utopia. And that can be seen in many, many ways. Laws are a clear way that this has been implemented historically and currently. So I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union a quote unquote free state. And while it is true that the Oregon Territory outlawed slavery in 1844, I would never call it free, because at the same time that the Oregon Territory outlawed slavery, it also outlawed Black people. That law included the first Black exclusion law that said Black people were not allowed to exist in the Oregon Territory. And again, the Oregon Territory included Oregon, Washington, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, and parts of Montana. So when you said Oregon Territory, you said the entire Northwest, pretty much. So the Northwest outlawed Black existence. It made it a crime to exist and be Black within the Oregon Territory. That first law also included the lash law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped up to 39 lashes every 6 months until we left the state. So that is part of the foundation of this place that we live. And the way that we know that this is the indication of a larger ideology of a racist white utopia is because the people who passed these laws said it themselves very clearly. So Peter Burnett, who was an influential legislator here in Oregon and who went on to become governor of California, actually helped to create the lash law. It was called Peter Burnett's lash law. And he said specifically about the lash law, quote, "The object is to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population, Black people. We are in a new world under the most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of those evils that have so much afflicted the United States and other countries," end quote. So he and others were very clear that this was both about excluding and brutalizing Black communities for the larger notion of building this perfect society that white people imagined they had been given here in the Northwest. That is not the only indication. When we look at the experiences of other communities of color, we see that all of them work to create this racist white utopia. You can see it operating through things like the 1850 Oregon Donation Land Act, which gave away at the end of the day 2.5 million acres of indigenous land in the Northwest for free to white people to build this racist white society. And again, this is the literal foundation of the place that we are living, built on stolen land and helped to be created and supported by things like brutal Black exclusion laws. And this information is, always timely and important, but especially now as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day earlier this week, which, on the calendar is still marked as Columbus Day. It's important to shift that language because we shift the lens from celebrating the conquest, the colonization, and the genocide to celebrating the resistance of Indigenous communities who have been organizing and mobilizing and existing and pushing back for centuries. So again, these are the foundations of this place that we live. And it resulted in Oregon being the only state in the union admitted with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. Oregon's constitution included the third Black exclusion law, which banned Black people from residing in the state, from holding real estate, from making contracts. There are many things that are important about this law. But one that I would like to point out right now is that the language of the Black exclusion law was not removed from Oregon's constitution until finally 2002. The process began in 2001, and it was finally removed in 2002. So into the 21st century, this Black exclusion language was part of Oregon's constitution. And that was not an oversight, because the Black community, again, as active change makers and not passive victims, came forward time and time again and said, both through the legislature and the ballot box, please remove this language from the Oregon Constitution and show us this is not the kind of place you want to be. And again, white Oregonians, by leaving it in, reinforced, actually, this is exactly the kind of place we want to be. For anyone who was here in 2001 and 2002, you remember it was a fight to get that language removed in the 21st century. There was pushback against it. It went to a ballot measure, and 30% of Oregonians voted to keep the Black exclusion language in the Constitution. Many of them citing things like wanting to preserve Oregon's history, which many of us heard as wanting to preserve this foundation of a racist white utopia. So again, leaving that language in was about sending a message about the kinds of place that Oregon wants to be. And this is not the only time that Oregon has done that. This is something that has happened again and again, using language and legislation to send messages. Just one other instance that I'm going to highlight was in 1868, around the 14th Amendment, which guarantees universal citizenship rights, which was ratified after the Civil War. And so it was ratified on a federal level. States can ratify amendments to show that they support them. Well, Oregon actually ratified and then quickly de-ratified the 14th Amendment, which until I began studying this history years ago, I didn't know you could de-ratify an amendment. It was not ratified for the final time until 1973. So again, this was about sending a message about the kind of place that white Oregonians wanted to live in. And this is not unique to Oregon, because while Oregon was bold enough to write it down explicitly because of the foundation of this place, because of who was here, and to reinforce that again and again, the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon, shaped every state in the Union, and shaped the nation as a whole. Because the foundation of this nation is the notion of manifest destiny, which is really the creation of a racist white utopia. The founding ideology of manifest destiny is the idea that God gave this land to white folks to colonize because indigenous people were not using it properly, and that they had the right to do whatever was necessary to make it productive, including genocide, theft of entire continents, chattel slavery. That is the idea of manifest destiny, and it is the foundation of the colonization of the Americas. And so this idea has resonated and rebounded here in Oregon and nationally throughout the centuries. It's not an idea that happened and then faded away. It's something that has been reinforced again and again up until today. So we can look at a quote here from a US senator who said this in the early 1900s. Quote, "God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing but vain and idle self-admiration. No, he has made us the master organizers of the world to establish system where chaos reigns. He has made us adept in government that we may administer government among savages. Were it not for such a force as this, the world would relapse into barbarism and night." So again, this is in essence the same idea that Peter Burnett put forward when justifying the Lash Law. The idea that white folks had to do this to create this ideal society, and that it justified any brutality against folks of color. So again, this is not just something that happened hundreds of years ago and we study because it's interesting or important. I, in fact, don't even like to call this history. I call it a living legacy because it moves with us every single day and it shapes all of our lives. Again, all of the institutions that shape our lives are rooted in this ideology. And so, A, we cannot begin to understand the place we live without this, and we can't begin to change it and institute true justice without understanding this. So again, the foundations of this society as a racist white utopia manifested differently in different communities. And it's absolutely important to learn those different histories and to explore them, to learn the different histories of how communities of color have been affected by white supremacy and how they have organized and resisted white supremacy. But specifically, my focus is on Oregon Black history. And so I want to be very clear, and looking at this history, we see again and again the foundations of the ways that Black communities are dealt with in Oregon is criminalization. From the very beginning, our existence here was considered to be a crime before Oregon was even a state. And we see that playing out and resonating over and over again, looking at the ways that laws are manifested, looking at the ways that institutions deal with Blackness, looking at the ways that justice is carried out or not carried out, depending on the color of your skin historically. And so I'm going to be running through just a few examples that are going to kind of be moving back and forth through history, pulling out some of these specific themes to explore more deeply. So in 1862, Oregon adopted a law that required Black, Chinese, and Hawaiian people residing in Oregon to pay an annual tax of $5. So this was truly a tax just for specific communities of color for the privilege of existing here in Oregon. $5 in 1862 was a lot of money. So if people could not pay that, they were actually arrested and forced into servitude to work for the state until they had paid off their fee to the state of Oregon. So again, not only is their identity being criminalized, not only are Black folks being arrested and forced to work as our Chinese and Hawaiian folks, but our very existence is being taxed as well. And it's important because a lot of the times when we talk about racism, white Northerners like to locate American racism in the South because it feels more comfortable to them. But when you look at the ways that Southern racism played out after the end of legal slavery in the South, you see that it actually mirrors things like this. The Black codes were codes that were specifically aimed at Black people that allowed them to be arrested, to be incarcerated, and to be worked either by the state or to be leased out to private entities, sometimes on the very plantations that they had been freed from, to be forced into servitude and labor again. In essence, forced back into slavery. And so these are not things that are isolated in the South. We had a law here passed in 1862 that replicated and in many ways led the way for those Black codes as well. I'm going to take a big leap forward because I just want to talk about the outcomes of the ways that this criminalization of Blackness manifests throughout time. And I'm just pulling one instance of the police murdering a Black person here in Oregon. There are unfortunately countless other examples that could be used. And I think it's important to show because it shows the way that the criminalization of Blackness is still very much at play today and shapes Black experiences with every indicator, especially with law enforcement. So in 1985, Lloyd Stevenson was murdered by Portland police. He was a Black man who went into 7-Eleven while it was being robbed. He was actually a good Samaritan and helped to stop the robbery. But when the police came, they began attacking Stevenson, even though the 7-Eleven clerk said, no, that's not him. He helped to stop the robbery. Police put Stevenson in a sleeper hold until his heart stopped and he died. No police did CPR on him, even though they were mandated to. In addition to that horrific brutalization of Stevenson, the Black community were outraged and protested and mobilized against police violence that had been ongoing. In response to that, Portland police officers made, sold, and wore shirts on the day of Stevenson's funeral that had a smoking gun and the phrase, "Don't choke 'em, smoke 'em," indicating rather than using a chokehold, Black people should just be shot. No police officer was ever punished for the murder of Lloyd Stevenson or for creating those and distributing and wearing those t-shirts. The officers who did create the t-shirts were fired and then reinstated again. In the history of the murders of Black people in Oregon, we see again and again police are not held accountable regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what Black folks were doing at the time. We see this echoed nationally with the raising up of names like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others. This is rooted in the criminalization of Blackness, the idea that no matter what Black folks are doing, we are criminalized, we are suspect, and law enforcement, as the outgrowth of the government of the state, has the right to do whatever it wants to us. And that was founded and rooted through things like the Black exclusion laws into this place that we live. And we see it very much playing out as we move forward. That criminalization of Blackness is incredibly clear in things like the 1994 passage of Measure 11, which was the mandatory minimum bill that resulted in an explosion in the Oregon prison population. It also incredibly disproportionately affects Black folks. Black people are 6 times as likely as white people to be incarcerated, even though we are not more likely to commit crimes than white folks. And so again, we see that this is a direct outgrowth of the criminalization of Blackness. In many ways, this is the new Black exclusion law. And this is the way that Blackness is dealt with in relationship to the state. So again, this is not history that is dead and long gone and interesting to study. It is a living legacy that is with us every day and is affecting all of our lives and is rooted into the foundations of this place we live. So that is a little bit around the criminalization of Blackness. Now, wanting to look at, there's a lot of talk happening now about what I call street level white supremacy, white supremacist organizations, vigilante groups, militias, those kinds of things. It is incredibly important to look at and to study them as they are mobilized and organized and growing across the nation and here in Oregon. There are a few things that are important to recognize specifically for Oregon. First of all, it is incredibly important to recognize that street level white supremacist organizations have always existed here in Oregon. And in fact, the founding ideology of Oregon as a racist white utopia makes this a perfect breeding ground for them. So it is not a surprise. And I know we have representation from cities across Oregon, but for people in Portland, often they find it hard to reconcile this notion of Portland as this liberal bastion with the huge numbers of active white supremacists that exist in the state. But when you know this history, you actually know that that is not surprising. It would be surprising given the foundations of this place if that was not the case. I think even more important than that, though, is to be very clear and to root in the notion that street level white supremacist violence and institutional white supremacist violence are not in conflict with one another. They actually work in tandem. They rely on one another and they support one another. And so it's incredibly important to combat street level white supremacist organizations. But it is also important to be clear that if every active white supremacist disappeared tomorrow, the material lives of folks of color would not marginally change, because white supremacy is built into the institutions that shape all of our lives, and business as usual functioning of those institutions mean the perpetuation of white supremacy. But I do want to look through a few instances historically so that we can see the ways that white supremacist violence has partnered with and been supported by street level white supremacist violence. So the first instance I want to highlight is Alonzo Tucker, who was a Black man who in 1902 was murdered in Coos Bay. He was accused of raping a white woman, even though there was conflicting eyewitness accounts that directly contradicted that. A mob of hundreds of people came for Tucker. He was tortured, he was shot, and then in front of 300 people, he was hung off of a bridge and left for hours. The support of white supremacist institutional entities was very clear in the case of Alonzo Tucker. Often we talk about lynchings as if it was something that happened under the cover of night, where we didn't know where it was. This was 300 people in broad daylight, and no one was ever indicted or held accountable for Tucker's murder. The marshal at the time of the town was there. He saw this happen and yet later said he didn't know who murdered Alonzo Tucker. Newspapers at the time were overwhelmingly supportive of his murder. A local newspaper described the lynch mob as quiet and orderly. And they also described Tucker as a Black fiend who got the death he so thoroughly deserved. And so again, to see the ways that street level white supremacy is supported by institutional white supremacy, in this case, the institutions of the coroner, the institutions of law enforcement, the institutions of media, all joining together to not only tolerate, but sanction, condone, and support this act, this brutal act of racist violence. One of the biggest organizations that comes up when you talk about the history of white supremacist violence is the Ku Klux Klan. We tell a lot of racial myths about the Klan. The idea that the Klan was an organization that was located in the South only, that it was made up of not formally educated working class white Southern men, and that it was an organization that died out. None of those things are true, right? At this moment, there are over 100 active Klan chapters in this country. The Klan existed nationally at its height. 15% of Americans who were eligible, which meant white men, because that's all they wanted, were members of the Klan. So at its height, nationally, 15% of white men were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan. Oregon is presumed to have the highest per capita Klan membership in the country. Again, at a time when communities of color, when the Jewish community, when Catholic communities were brutally maintained and kept small, that Klan membership was also about sending a message about the kinds of place that people wanted to live. The last myth is this idea that the Klan, again, was a fringe organization that did not reach into the highest echelons of power. That is a falsehood across the board. In Portland, in Oregon, in the nation, Klan reached into the highest echelons of power. One example of that is this picture, which you can see posed with hooded Klansmen are the Portland police chief, the district attorney, the US attorney, the Multnomah County sheriff, and the Portland mayor, under a headline saying they are taking guidance from the Klan about what the Klan would like to see happen in Portland. So again, not only did they meet with the Klan, they were happy to pose for a picture that they knew would be put into the newspaper with the Klan. That was Portland. In Oregon as a state, the Klan actually across the country in the 1922 elections swept elected offices in cities and towns across Oregon, and they put into play Walter Pierce as governor, who worked with the Klan hand in hand to pass many acts of legislation, like the Compulsory Education Act, which was about eliminating private schools, as well as literacy tests for voting, which we often think of again as a tool of racial control in the South. We had them here in Oregon, thanks to the Klan and Walter Pierce. So again, when we're talking about the responsibilities of government, it's incredibly important to recognize that historically in Oregon, the government has not operated in opposition to these white supremacist groups. They have worked hand in hand. So the ideology of the Klan is not a fringe ideology. It sits at the heart and in communion with the ideology of the founding of this place. And if we are wanting to institute true racial justice, then we will have to do the hard institutional work to change that. I just want to connect this nationally, as I was talking about before. So when you look at, again, the Klan, you see their powers in Portland, in Oregon, reaching into the highest offices of governance. The same was true for this country as a whole. So President Woodrow Wilson at this time wrote a pro-Klan history book earlier in his career. The pro-Klan history book became the basis for the novel The Klansman, which was the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is perhaps the most virulently racist film that has ever been created. Its whole point is to glorify the birth of the Klan and to show them as white saviors protecting white communities and especially white womanhood. Birth of a Nation was also the first film that screened in the White House. And Woodrow Wilson would show this film to visiting dignitaries as if it were a documentary. So again, the Klan ideology was not in opposition to the ideology of America at that time. They worked in tandem with one another. The other piece about Birth of a Nation that I want to highlight, and again, is very much about that idea of showing Black communities and other communities of color as active change makers and not passive victims, is to show the organizing that happened here, led by the work of the Portland chapter of the NAACP and other Black organizations, to ban the screening of the film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation screened in this country for years, because back then there weren't a lot of films that were screening. They would be shown year after year in theaters. It was always packed with white people. And in the wake of screenings of Birth of a Nation across this country over and over again, white mobs would then go out and attack Black communities. It was the clarion call to white supremacist violence to be done against Black communities. And so the Portland chapter of the NAACP, organized at that time, successfully petitioned the city council of Portland to ban the screening of any film which would stir up hatred between the races, and then specifically to ban Birth of a Nation. And I want to, again, raise this up because it's important to show the leadership and vision of Black communities, and also to show the courageous history of organizing that exists at a time where the Klan was at its height, was organizing, where the Klan power reached into government on every levels. Black communities were still organizing and mobilizing to make this a better place for everyone. And so it's incredibly important to highlight and root in that history. So this leads me to talk about the idea of sundown towns. Sundown towns are purposely all white towns, and that is enforced by law, by custom, and always by violence or the threat of violence, where Black folks and other folks of color most often are told, you are not welcome. It is the same ideology that founded Oregon and the Northwest, this idea of a racist white utopia. It's important because this shows the intersections of those two different forms of white supremacist violence I was talking about, the intersections of street level white supremacist violence and institutional white supremacist violence, and show the ways that they work in tandem to create the ecosystem of a racist white town. The leading scholar on sundown towns, James Loewen, has documented almost 25 sundown towns in Oregon historically. And this slide and this time actually references Medford and Rogue Valley, where a sign was up that had much more racist language than this, telling Black people they were not welcome. And this is the time that it came down in the 1960s. And so it's important, again, to recognize that history is not something that is dead and gone. It's not something that only exists in the South. And it is not something that is separate from the ways that governance administers itself and the ways that this shapes the institutions and our lives. And I just wanted to offer a reference and a resource for folks. James Loewen has a great book called Sundown Towns. He also has a website. So if you go to Sundown Towns, the website, you can read more information. There's actually an interactive map. So you can click on it and there'll be a list of towns, and then you can click on the town and read the evidence that proves it was a sundown town. It's incredibly important to know this history and to not allow it to be erased, because the 1960s were not that long ago. And to be clear, there are still active sundown towns today. Just like the Klan, this is not something that happened in the past and is over. It is something that is very much with us in Oregon and across the nation, and something that must be contended with if we are actually going to institute true and real racial justice. The other side, when we're talking about white supremacy and housing and place, is the ways that communities of color in general, and for this presentation, Black communities specifically, have been controlled in terms of housing. And so I usually do a case study around Portland. I know that's not necessarily relevant to everyone who's here, so I will not go into all of that. If folks are interested, please feel free to read and look at the Oregon Black History Timeline that I shared the YouTube video for. But it is incredibly important to note that housing is one of the ways that we see white supremacy built into foundations, and that the everyday functioning of those systems perpetuates that. And so we see the history of segregation, the history of things like redlining, which is literally drawing lines on a map and saying that inside those small lines, usually the most undesirable land is the only place that Black and sometimes other people of color can rent or buy. Those have shaped the foundations of our cities. They have literally been carved into our cities. And we cannot talk about instituting justice without addressing the ways that communities have been controlled and constrained, as well as excluded. And again, it shows the interweaving together of public and private interests. And so, just one example is this slide from 1919, the Portland Realty Board Code of Ethics mandated real estate agents were not allowed to sell to individuals whose race was determined to lower the property values of the neighborhood. And that was later changed to specifically say Black and Asian people. And so that was just one of the many ways that racial segregation and redlining manifested itself and continues to manifest itself to this day. And I wanted to offer as a resource this incredible piece by Dr. Karen Gibson called Bleeding Albina, A History of Community Disinvestment. You can download it for free by Googling it. And it explores that history using Portland as a case study, and the historic Black community in Portland, which is albina, which is why it's called Bleeding Albina. So I will not in any way go through all of this, but I strongly encourage folks to read this, because it gives a case study again of how government and institutions work together with private interests to form this massive and continuing disinvestment in the Black community. And it's important. One of the pieces that Gibson talks about is the idea that if we are only talking about the process of gentrification as a process that starts in the 1990s, then we are not seeing the real history, and we are missing how deeply rooted gentrification is in a history of racial segregation and white supremacy. And so I just wanted to give a little information that shows that, because Gibson talks about in Albina, the history of gentrification really begins with the first wave of urban renewal, which happened in Albina in 1956. Albina was the place that 4 out of 5 Black people lived in Portland. So Albina was the Black community. And with the approval of the construction of the Memorial Coliseum and then the highways going in, those were put right on top of the heart of Albina, and it destroyed that community, and it displaced families, businesses, and the entire community. And that was the beginning of this process of gentrification that many folks only note as starting in the 1990s. So I just wanted to offer a definition of gentrification, because I think we often use that word, but we don't necessarily mean the same thing. And without a shared definition, we're actually not having a good conversation. So gentrification is the process of displacing and replacing working class, poor communities, overwhelmingly Black and brown, with wealthier, whiter communities. It is a multi-decade, deliberate, intentional, and structural process where private interests work with government. That piece is really important, because I think often government frames itself as not being part of the process of gentrification, when the reality is, like every other piece we have talked about, government sits at the heart and the intersection of this issue. Criminalization, over-policing, and incarceration of the original community are a key function of how gentrification happens. Gentrification is a violent process. And that piece is really important, because it shows the way that these institutions work in tandem and work together. So policing and gentrification, housing displacement, are working in tandem to marginalize and to exploit the Black community in this instance. And lastly, gentrification is not the same as community development, where the existing community has self-determination and the resources to address concerns and make it healthier and better for everyone there. That's really important, because often people say, well, aren't there good things about gentrification? There's nothing good about gentrification, because gentrification is a process of displacing the existing community with wealthier, whiter people. Self-determination is great. Community development for that community that exists is important. Providing resources and support to that community is important. But destroying that community, utilizing violent means to do so, and working in tandem with public and private interests is not positive by any stretch of the imagination. So that is a working definition of gentrification. And the last piece of that I just want to show is these maps that show visually what that process looked like for Albina, for the Black community in Portland. And so you can see her here in 1970, it shows a map. And the darkest color is areas that have 50% or more Black people. And then the next color is 30 to 49%, and so on. So 50% or more are the darkest colors. So there was a Black community. And again, that Black community was thriving and was strong despite being overexploited and under-resourced, because Black folks, again, have always been active change makers and not passive victims. We see that continues into 1980 with the census numbers, where we even see communities expanding in North and Northeast Portland. There are more areas that have larger populations of Black folks. That continues through 1990 as well. And we see that even Black majority communities have grown. And then 2000. In less than 10 years, there is no longer a community that has majority Black population because of gentrification, because of the displacement of these communities that have been dispersed in multiple directions. And then we come to 2010, and it's even worse. So now we no longer have a community that's more than 30% Black. And again, that's a less than 10-year period. So in less than 20 years, we went from growing Black communities to not having any community in Portland that has more than 30% Black folks. And Portland is the only major city in the country that does not have a majority Black community. So just so you can compare 1970 to 2010 and how quickly that happens. So you can see the visual representation of these forces working together. So this brings me to the last point that I wanted to make, but as I said at the top, it is the point that I think is even the most important, is viewing people of color as active change makers and not passive victims. And I have hopefully shown you throughout this presentation historical instances of that. But I really want to hone in on this because I think this is often the difference of changes and policies and attempts being rooted in communities versus something that is being done for communities that often doesn't address the underlying white supremacist institutional problems and doesn't actually change the lived conditions of communities of color. It's incredibly important to recognize that all racial justice has happened because of the courage of communities of color. The fact that Black communities exist in Oregon at all is incredible because we were never supposed to be here. And it is only through the determination, the courage, and the creativity and community building that Black folks have created home here where we were never supposed to be. It's incredibly important to recognize that it is that leadership and vision that have pushed for and created true racial justice. Nothing has come out of the kindness of the system because that's not how social change happens. Systems that are rooted in oppression don't just wake up one morning and say, oh, maybe we should be better. Change happens from the bottom up, not the top down. And that's a question to ask yourself as folks involved in government, is to say, are you going to stand with communities of color who are working actively to create racial justice, or do you stand against them? And if you are standing with communities of color, it means not just bringing them into the conversation, but centering those communities, those organizations, those individuals who have been holding and working for and creating racial justice for decades. And to be clear, racial justice is justice. You cannot have justice without racial justice. If you are telling me that you are a just place, but there is not racial justice, then what you're telling me is, in essence, you are trying to create a mini racist white utopia. And so for real justice to exist, the leadership of communities of color has to be centered. People of color do not need saviors. They need allies and accomplices that will join in the work that has already been happening for decades. Just because folks are coming to this work new does not mean there has not been a long and unbroken thread of organizing happening. Karen Gibson actually talks about the continuous thread of resistance that exists within Black communities. And it's important to see that here in Oregon, and it's important to learn that history. So I want to give just 3 short examples of that history to share with folks, to root and show that this is not new, but this is something that has been ongoing for, in some cases, centuries. So specifically, 1867 was an incredibly important year because it gained public school access for Black communities in Salem as well as Portland. They used different means, but I wanted to highlight Salem specifically because the Black community in Salem got together and raised $427.50 to start a school, a separate school to educate their children when their children were not allowed to attend Salem's public schools. Salem's Black community then organized and pressured the Salem School District to take over the governance of the school for the Black children, which they did. That is, to me, incredible organizing because, again, 1867, Black folks actually don't have legal standing in Oregon at that time. And for this community to raise that much money, which was a lot of money in 1867, to address their own needs while still organizing and mobilizing for the long-term survival of that school is incredible. Also, gaining access to public schools for Black children meant more access to public education for other marginalized communities as well. So it's important to recognize, again, as I said, racial justice actually creates more opportunities for everyone. And the work of the Black community, specifically in this case, to gain public school education for their children also opened up public education for other marginalized communities. I wanted to highlight 1923, a Black community that formed in Eastern Oregon in Walidah County in Maxville, where 60 skilled Black workers came with their families to work in the lumber yards. And I think, again, I know folks are represented across the state, and often, the histories of people of color, and especially the Black community, is located in Portland when folks talk about it. And while the majority of Black folks have mostly lived in Portland, the reality is there have been strong Black communities across this state. And Black folks have been part of the history of every part of this state, on many levels. And so every community in Oregon has a history and a living legacy to explore, to learn from, to contend with, and to change. And so I wanted to offer this as an opportunity, also because Gwen Trice, who is actually the daughter of one of the original lumber workers, made a documentary called The Logger's Daughter. She has also started a historical center to explore that history of Maxville as well. And so creating public permanent places to go to learn this history and to explore is one of the things that happens when you center the leadership and voices of Black people. The last example I want to share is the Black Panther Party. So the Black Panther Party was actually a national organization. At its height, it had 50 chapters. Oregon actually had 2 chapters, one in Eugene and one in Portland. There's a lot that has been said about the Black Panther Party, and I don't have time to dispel all of the myths now, so I definitely encourage folks to do their own historical research on that. But one of the things that dispels many of the myths about the party is that when you learn, the only program that every chapter of the Black Panther Party was mandated to have was a free breakfast for children program. And they fed tens of thousands of children every day across this country. In fact, the reason that we have free and reduced lunch programs through the federal government is the Black Panther Party, because this organization that was completely grassroots, did not receive federal funding, did not receive grant funding, operated solely through donations of resources, time, and energy, was able to feed more children than the United States government. And very soon after, the federal free breakfast for children and reduced breakfast for children program started in schools. One of the other programs that many of the chapters had was a healthcare clinic. In Portland, they had 2 health clinics. One was a general health clinic and one was a dental clinic. That dental clinic was actually taken over by Oregon Health Sciences University and is still running to this day. So because of the Black Panther Party, that community has had, under the Panthers, access to free dental care, and under OHSU, access to low-income dental care for almost 50 years. And every one of the Panthers programs was open to anyone who needed it. So there were no restrictions placed on it. They fed everyone who came in, regardless of color. They fed adults as well as children. the question folks were asked when they came into these clinics was, what is wrong and how can we help make it better? I share this example because I think it shows very clearly that when the leadership and vision of communities of color in general and the Black community specifically are centered, institutions that make our entire community safer, healthier, and more whole are formed. We often operate under a scarcity mentality that says, there's only so much resources to go around. But the reality is that when we center the leadership and vision and the work of communities of color, we see that more resources are generated and we come from a place of abundance. And so talking about taking the leadership of communities of color in general and the Black community specifically, it's important to recognize that communities have been making plans for decades. This is not just folks, coming forward and saying these things aren't good. Folks have come forward and created strategic plans, policy priorities, ideas and long-term goals for institutional change. So if you are wanting to truly do the work of institutional change, then I would strongly encourage folks to get those resources that have already been created, to connect with those organizations who have been putting out this work and doing this grassroots intellectual imagining for the future. And I'll just share two resources very quickly. There are many, many more, but there's the State of Black Oregon report. The last full report was put out in 2015, but there have been updates. It is full of both disparities, racial disparities, and showing them across indicators, but even more policy objectives, ideas for change, based on different issue areas. You can download it for free. So the State of Black Oregon report. And then the Portland African American Leadership Forum put out the People's Plan. And these are two of the questions that they asked people. The process was bringing together the Black community for years in dozens of different scenarios and asking them questions. Out of that, pulling ideas about the future concretely. How can we change the future? One big area they talk about is housing, but there's also education and many other areas as well. So again, this process was very grassroots, was very focused on what are folks coming together and saying they want for the future. So it offers both an outcome and data, and it offers a process as well for folks to engage with. Lastly, and these are just some examples of what it looks like inside the People's Plan, just so you can kind of get a sense with the problem statement, actions and advocacy with concrete examples, as well as current programs. So there's lots of resources and ideas. These are great starting places. Again, they are one of many. And lastly, I just wanted to be clear that, this is not work that is only happening in Portland. I have been traveling around this state for over 8 years, doing Oregon Black history work, and have encountered so many organizations that are working around racial justice. This is a very incomplete list of those organizations that people told me about as I was traveling around. And it represents so many counties in Oregon, so many cities and towns in Oregon, tens of thousands of people who are organizing, mobilizing to create a more just future today. So whatever town you're in, whatever county you're in, I guarantee there have to be people doing this work. And so to be looking for those change makers locally, as well as connecting statewide with other folks and other ideas around that. So the last thing I want to say before I end this keynote is I find studying history very useful for many reasons. One of them is learning to take the historical long view. Because when you take the historical long view, things that seem complicated in the moment get very simple. We look back and we see big issues that at the time often folks thought had many different sides. But through the lens of history, we see that there is a right side and there's a wrong side. So white folks thought the issue of slavery was complicated. There were white people who were advocating for reform to slavery, for a kinder, gentler slavery. I would hope that everyone who is watching this now looks back and realizes there was a right side and a wrong side to history. And those people who wanted to tinker with and reform slavery were on the wrong side of history. There were white Americans who debated whether or not joining the fight against Nazism in World War II was the right thing to do. There are white folks who defended and supported apartheid in South Africa. Again, every issue we look back on at that time, people were told, well, this is complicated. But history allows us to see it's actually not complicated. There's a right side and there's a wrong side. There's a side of justice and a side of oppression. And it's incumbent on all of us to choose which side we will be on. So that's what I'll leave you with. When history is written, what side do you want to be on in the final telling of that history? If you want to be on the side of justice, if you want to be on the right side of history, then you have to commit yourself to doing the hard, drastic work of institutional change. It will not be easy. It will not be simple. It will be a deep uprooting of the foundations of the place that we are. But it is the only way to institute true justice. If you are not doing that actual work, then regardless of the language you're using or the words you're saying, you are not choosing to be on the side of history, because history remembers what we do and what we don't do. And so I know that I have been working very hard to try to end up on the side of justice. And I hope that other folks will make that choice as well. But please, know that that is the framework through which our actions will be judged. And so if in the moment you're struggling, I encourage you to say in 100 years, what will people look back and thank me for doing in this moment? What will people who believe in justice look back and thank me for doing in this moment? And then do that. Thank you so much for having me as the keynote. Take care.